I statements. If you've ever been to a conflict resolution or a group therapy session, you've probably heard the facilitator say right from the outset, make sure you speak in I statements. So, for instance, rather than saying, you never listen to my sermons, you would say something like, I feel overlooked when my sermons are ignored. The purpose is to encourage participants to own their feelings rather than blaming or accusing the other person. So I statements are meant to de-escalate potentially explosive interactions. We can talk about the sermon thing at coffee hour. It's fine. Of course, not all I statements do this. The I statements made by the rich man in this morning's so-called parable of the rich fool don't have this effect at all. During his egocentric and somewhat comical inner monologue, he uses the word I 6 times, and not in an I'm taking ownership of my feelings kind of way. But even before we get to the rich fool, it's interesting, isn't that a great name for a parable? But anyway, but even before we get to him, it's interesting to see what prompted Jesus to take on the topic of greed in the first place. In the verses immediately preceding this section, we hear that a crowd of many thousands had gathered to listen to Jesus. And Jesus is doing his Jesus thing. He's preaching and teaching to the multitudes, when suddenly the whole flow is interrupted by a man who pushes his way through the crowd and demands that Jesus tell his brother to divide his inheritance with him. Bless you. Now, we don't know what the particular situation was other than there were grievances involved. The two siblings probably should have sat down with a mediator and been encouraged to speak in I statements. But what we do know is that this man didn't show up that day to be inspired or challenged or changed by Jesus' words. He wanted something from him. And what he wanted from him was something for himself. He wanted the money from his father's estate, and he figured with Jesus' authority and stature behind him, he could get it. So that's who we're dealing with here, a bully. Someone who sees every interaction as transactional. Someone who thinks only about his own needs and his own wealth. Someone who literally pushes past others to get what he wants. Someone who lives in the egocentric nature of I statements and not the good kind. All of this happens before we even get to Jesus' story about the rich fool. So it's this man's interruption that prompts Jesus to warn us to be on guard against greed, to remind us that our lives are about more than an abundance of possessions. And he illustrates this point by telling this brief parable about a rich man who, following a bountiful harvest that produces more grain than he could possibly use, starts talking to himself and using all of those I's. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Which all sounds great, except that he has effectively placed himself and his needs and his comfort at the very center of the universe. And God looks at him, shakes his head, and says, "You fool, on this very night, your life will be demanded of you." The rich fool's greed is a barrier to following Jesus. His self-centered I statements are an obstacle to following Jesus. And he has completely missed the point of what it means to live a meaningful life. There's no recognition that all that he has comes from God. There's no sense of interconnectedness with those around him. And this is such an easy trap for us to fall into. Because when you think about it, society would contend that the rich fool is doing exactly the right and prudent thing by storing up his wealth. He's creating a rainy day fund. He's guaranteeing his family's economic security. He's saving for retirement by saving and investing wisely. All of these messages we hear about the importance of the Protestant work ethic and the virtues of unbridled capitalism and stockpiling money and measuring our self-worth by our net worth point to this rich fool actually being incredibly wise. If we met this guy, rather than denigrate him, we'd make him the CEO. It makes me think of Aesop's fable about the ant and the grasshopper. Do you remember that one? During the warm summer months, which is something we can all relate to, the ant works hard to gather and store food for the winter. Meanwhile, the grasshopper spends his time singing and dancing and enjoying the sunshine while mocking the ant for working so hard. But when the days get shorter and winter arrives, the grasshopper has nothing to eat. Cold and hungry, he goes to the ant to beg for food. But the ant refuses, telling the grasshopper that he should have worked hard and prepared during the summer months instead of wasting his time on frivolous things. And the moral of the story is, prepare today for the needs of tomorrow. To which most of us would say, right on. But what do you think Jesus would make of this story? I'm guessing he'd have a slightly different take. Jesus would probably say to the ant, "Well done, faithful ant. You've been wise to prepare for the winter, but now it's time to love your neighbor. Don't hoard your harvest, share it." And I'm realizing that I am now having Jesus speak to an ant, so it's okay. But the point is, God isn't opposed to barns or possessions or 401ks, but God is opposed to hoarding and greed and selfishness. God is opposed to putting ourselves at the center of the universe at the expense of others. God is opposed to putting our trust in our possessions instead of in God. And you start to see that what's missing from the rich fool's inner monologue is any inkling of his sharing his abundance with others, of being generous to those who go without. That's the way of Jesus, of course. It may not be the way of the rich fool or of the ant or of our society and its obsession with and fetishization of wealth, but sharing rather than hoarding, giving rather than receiving, opening our hearts rather than closing our fists, living a life of generosity rather than of self-interest. That's the way of Jesus. And it is often just so hard for us. It pushes against so many of the things we've been taught to believe and to believe in. But when it comes to your material possessions and your financial resources, are you living more like Jesus or are you living more like that ant? In what ways do your financial choices and giving patterns recognize that God is the ultimate source of all that you possess? I'm not sure why it's so hard for us to be generous when God has been so generous with us. But it is. And for most of us, the freedom of living a life of genuine generosity remains, if not elusive, then at least a work in progress. We're trying. And as we reflect on how we might live less like the ant, less like the rich fool, and more like Jesus, it helps us to remember that all things come of thee, O Lord, and of thine own have we given thee.